Today's daf is daf Yud Zayin, and the Gemara records a Makkos, which is brought down here by Rav Yosef, with regard to what's called T'mai. T'mai means that you bought tfua from an Amoritz, you don't know if he was mafresh masros, and because of that suffix, you have to be mafresh masros. Now we have something called Maser Oni Shel T'mai, which means that on years 3 and 6 of the Shemitah cycle, you have to be mafresh meiser ani. And the question is, what exactly is meiser ani? Is it what we call dine momenos, or is it dine iser veheter? So according to one Tana, that's Rabbi Eliezer, since D'mai is a suffix, if the aniyim come and they demand meiser, they say, well, it's coming to us, but it's only a suffix. So we have a principle called amotzi mechaver levaraya. So therefore, according to Rabbi Eliezer, there's no chiyuv to be mafresh maser ani from D'mai. But the Chachamim disagree, and they say the following: okay, fine. As far as the monetary dimension is concerned, you don't have to give the maser ani from D'mai over to the aniyim. But korei es Hashem, at least you have to be mafresh the maser. And the Gemara now on the top of our Omud is going to try to explain the fundamental beginning of this machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. Ma'ila b'haka miflagi. Temar savar vaday tovlo. According to the Chachamim, you definitely have to be mafresh maser ani from T'mai, because the halacha is that in a case of a suffix, you have to be machmir. And Mar Sovar, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, they never ever established a chiyuv maser in the case of maser ani in T'mai. And that's called in the language of the Gemara, Mar Sovar Vaday Eno Tovlo. So the Gemara now rejects Rav Yosef and says, Omerle Abaye ihachi, if you're telling me that the machlokes shin Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim is dependent upon whether or not you have an isu tevel if you are not mafresh maser oni from T'mai, then adam miflagi besfeiko, maybe there should be a machlokas on a more fundamental level, liflagu bevadai, even in a case where we know that he's chayev in maser oni, so it's not T'mai, we know for sure that there was never a frasha from maser oni, then maybe we should say that even in the case of Vadai, that we could have machlokas whether it's tovel or not tovel, meaning what's the halach in the case of Vadai. So the Gemara, therefore, based on Abai's objection, rejects Rav Yosef. El kuli alma Vadai tovlo. There was never machlokas about Vadai. That surely in a case of Maser Oni, there is a generation of a chalos tevel. Therefore, according to Abai, we have to find a substitute for the explanation of the machlokas and the brayso between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, and that is Mar Sover lo nechshedu amioritz al maser oni shel T'mai, and Rabbanan Savri, etc., that they are chashud. What does this mean? That although in the case of T'mai of an Amoritz, we're afraid that they weren't mafresh maser rishon or maser sheni, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, we're not afraid that they won't be mafresh maser ani, because with regard to maser ani, everybody, even somebody like an Amoritz, would certainly be mafresh maser ani. Now, I'm not sure if it means because they feel for the aniyim, or maybe because since it's only a monetary obligation, therefore they're more machmir about it. But it seems that, according to Rabbi Lezer at least, keva de mamona hu afrushe mafresh, since the entire nature of Maser Ani is to provide money for the poor people, so even the Amma Oretz is very makpid about that. It's like being part of a community and feeling, responsibility to support the poor people in the community. That's something that was universally accepted, and no one should be suspected of violating that. But the Rabbanan Savri, no. Came in the Trichale Milson. Now I'm not sure exactly what the Gemara has in mind by Trichale. What's the big tirch of being mafresh maser oni? I guess since he's going to have to calculate how much is maser, and he has to then deliver it over to the ani. So even though he feels for the aniyim, but nevertheless we still suspect him that he doesn't want to go through this entire trouble of being mafresh maser on it. Now, the end of the Mishnah tells us that in order to be chayav malchus for eating tevel, you have to eat a kizayis worth. However, there's a machlokus recorded here between Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim about what's called a birya. A birya means something that exists in the world in its natural state. Like, for example, a full animal or full small creature. And Rabbi Shimon comes along and he says that when it comes to a birya, the whole halacha Moshe Misinai of shiurim, in this case the shiur of kizayis, doesn't apply. And why is that so? Because a kernel of chita is a birya. It's in its natural state. And therefore, even if this chita of tevel is less than a kizayis, nevertheless, it's a birya. And you're chayiv for a birya even if it's less than a kizayis. The Chachamim disagree. So the Gemara now records a machlokas about the extent of this machlokas. And the machlokas the Gemara is going to present are two versions of what did Reish Lakish say. According to Bibi Omer Reish Lakish, machlokas bechita aval bekemach divya kol kizayis. Even Reb Shimon argues, Reb Bibi in the name of Reish Lakish would agree that you need a kizayis worth of flour of tevel. Why? Because once you crush the chita, it's no longer a birya. And even Reb Shimon would have to agree that flour is not the natural state in which the kernel of chita exists. However, Rabbi Yirmiyah Omer Reb Shimon Lakish, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah's version of Reish Lakish, ki machlokas bezu, kach machlokas bezu. There's a machlokas not only in chita itself, where Reb Shimon argues it's a birya and therefore it doesn't require kizayis to generate a chiv malchus, but even in the case of flour of kemach, which was a chita that was crushed down and made into kemach, even that case, Rabbi Shimon argues, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah's version, that you get malchus, even if it's less than a kizayis. And I think what's going on here is that, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Shimon's logic of the chita should extend even after you crush the chita and make it into flour, meaning it's not griure garye, it's iule alya. It's when you take chita and you make it into flour, you're not destroying the chita. On the contrary, you're upgrading the status of the chita. Now it could be used as chemical. You could bake a loaf of bread. And therefore, Shimon goes ahead and he says that once you have a birya, and therefore you're chayiv for even less than a kizayis, if you upgrade the level of the birya, even though it's no longer nikar, you can't see that it's a birya. I mean, you don't look at kemach and say, "Oh, that's the natural state of a kernel of wheat." But nevertheless, by upgrading its status, all the chumras that applied before you upgraded it while it was clearly a birya, continue to exist. So the Gemara now wants to prove that the tradition of Rabbi Bibi is correct from a Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah is going to discuss the case of a different kind of a birya, one that we touched on 2 days ago on Daf Tes Vav, and that's in the context of shkatzim v'ramosim. And what you do is, if you eat one of these shkatzim v'ramosim when it's in its natural state, then you incur malchus, because it's a birya. And it says the following: Amar lehem Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon turns to the Chacham and says, "Iatem modimli, don't you have to confess to me the ochel nemola kol shushu chayev, that in a case of a nemola, even if it's less than a kazayis, if you swallow it, you chayev 5 sets of malchus." Amulo, I agree to that. You don't need a kazayis in the case of achilas nemola, but neshiv kibir yasa. It's in its original state. Amalehem, so Rav Shimon contends and argues back, and he says, Afchita kibiria, even a chita is in its original natural state, and therefore it should have the status of a birya. You don't need a kazayas in the case of teva. So the Gemara now is medayik from the language of the Mishnah. When did Rav Shimon argue back to the Chachamim? It was only in the case of a whole chita in its natural state and considered a birya, but he didn't go. Rav Shimon didn't go a step further and say that even kemach is considered a birya, and therefore yechai fachilas kemach of tevel and less than a kazayis. No, kemach lo. Gemara says no, that's no proof. Rav Shimon is only arguing against the Chachamim on the turf of the Chachamim. L'divrayim kamer Lidi diafilu kemach nami. I'm going to go a step further and say that once the chita has the status of a birya, then it maintains its status l'chumra even after you crush it and make it into flour. But l'didchu. But according to you, the Chacham, you agree in the case of nemola that if you eat a full nemola in its natural state before crushing it down, you chayiv, even though it's small, it's less than a kazayis. Oduli mius techita achas kibir yosa. At least you should accept the equation between a nemola and a chita. It's still in its original natural state. It's a birya. For Rabbanon, the opponents say, wait a minute, you can't compare something that's an animate object to something that's an inanimate object. Biryas neshama chashuva. When does the Torah grant a serious upgraded status to a birya? That's only because it has a neshama, meaning it has a soul to it, so to speak. It's an animal that lives, and that's the case of an amola. But chita lo chashuva. A wheat kernel is not chashuv. It doesn't have a neshama. It's only an inanimate object. It's a growth. It's a plant, and therefore you don't get malchus for eating a chita of tevel unless you eat a kazayis with. But the truth is that Reb Shimon himself, who applied the principle and the status of birya even to a chita, he would go a step further and say that even if you convert the kernel of wheat into flour, you'd still maintain the chumrah of birya. Tanya Kavose de Rabbi Yirmiyah. Now the Gemara says, I have a brisa to support Rabbi Yirmiyah, who went a step further and said that Rabbi Shimon, even in the case of Kemach, applies the halach of birya. Rabbi Shimon Omer Kol Shula Makkos. Lo Omru Kizayis El Linyan Carbon. Now, I believe, and you know what? I was very disappointed here that I had to say what I think is obvious. So let me take a look in Masifta for a second. I'm sorry, I apologize, but just to make sure that what I'm about to tell you is correct. I can't believe that the Masifta will miss this point. Oh, Rabbi Shimon Omer Kol Shula Makkos. Ah, Bechol HaYisurim. That's what I was looking for. I don't know why the art scroll missed this point, but Bechol HaYisurim, Rabbi Shimon has a different transmission, a different Kabbalah as far as the halacha of Shiurim are concerned. And he says, as far as all the Shiurim are concerned, for all Isurim, to get Malchus, all you need is a Kolshu. You don't need a Kizayas. We have a Kabbalah, we have a transmission from Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai that the shear for Chiv Malchus in forbidden foods is only a Kizayas, not less than a Kizayas. That's only Lekarma. Lo Amru, Kizayas, Ella, Lekarban. Let me just see if he adds anything about why carbon is different. No, he doesn't seem to discuss this. So I would just take a stab at it before we start the Mishnah, which is the main subject of today's daf, that the Torah is much more machmir in carbon as a so-called punishment. But again, the purpose of a carbon is really lekapar for atonement, but it's also a punishment at the same time. And the Torah is machmir because in carbon you're chayav even for shogeg. So the Torah, by upgrading the chiyuv and the severity and the application of the chiyuv, now has to be makil and say, well, you had to do an avera chashuva to upgrade the impact, so to speak, or the status of the avera and make it into an achila of a kizayis. And only then will you be chayev a carbon even in shogeg. Ha'ochel, we start the Mishnah now. Ha'ochel bikurim ad shelo kara alehem. Okay, so bikurim have two stages. Number one, you have to designate it as bikurim. They used to actually, the Mishnah in bikurim describes how they used to tie a little colored string around it. This is the first, the first fruits on the tree that came out. And that's called Kriyas Shem. That's stage number one, Shlav Aleph. Then we go on to the second stage, and that is Kriya. Kriya means that the Bikurim require a recitation of a parsha, which is in Parshas Ki Tavo. We're familiar with it from Leil HaSeder, Arami Ovid Ovi. And the question is, when does the mitzvah of Bikurim complete itself? Is it with the Kriyas Shem, which is stage number one, or do we have to wait until we get to the second stage, and he actually brings the Bikurim to the Beis HaMikdash, he places them on the Mizbeach, and that's called Hanocha. So it's not enough, A, that you are Korei Shem, you need also a second stage of Kriyas HaParsha, and you read the Parsha, and the Mishnah now takes a stab at this and establishes that as soon as you are Korei Aleh Hashem and you designate it as Bikurim, then it's considered Bikurim, even though you aren't Korei as Haparsha of Aromi Ovid Ovid. Now, if you already have completed and generated the status of Bikurim with Kriyas Shem, then if you eat Bikurim, we'll see the details, you'll be Chayav Malchus. Okay. Next. Kodshe kodshim chutz lekloim. So kodshe kodshim, like for example chatos and osham, the basar is eaten by zichrei kahuna within the azara, and he went ahead, even if he was a kohen, but he ate it outside the azara. Gets malchus. Kodshim kalim umaser sheni chutz lechom. But shlomim, for example, and a carbon toda, and how much more so a bechar, can be eaten anywhere within the environments of Yerushalayim, within the walls of Yerushalayim. But if he eats kodshim kalim outside of Yerushalayim, he incurs malchus. That's called chutz lechom. Now, the Torah says with regard to the achila of carbon pesach, etzem lo tishbru bo, that you're not allowed to break a bone. Some say that's why the mitzvah is to eat it al asova. So you've already satiated yourself by eating the korban chagiga. You're not starving, and therefore you won't break the bone. But if he went ahead and he shovers etzem v'pesach atar, meaning the korban pesach was tar, and therefore it's royal achila, so it's designated for the mitzvah achila, and therefore it generates the lav of etzem lo sishbrubo. Hareza lokar bami gets malchus. Now, what about nosar? Now, we had a long discussion about nosar, if you recall, on Daf Tes Vav, that if you leave the basar carbon over beyond the allotted time, it becomes nosar, and you violate the Iser Lav of Lo Sasiru Menu Ad Boker, but you don't get malchus. Even if the basar is tahar, and by leaving it over, you made it nosar, and then again, you went ahead and wait, I just wonder, is this a case where he ate the nosar or a case just just 1 second. Once again, I think I just to be sure that what I say is right. So Mosir has nothing to do with the previous case of breaking a bone. Right? If you break a bone of the carbon pesach, we said you incur a chi of malchus because it says etzem lo sishbrubo. Now, in the case of Moser Bitar, right, he didn't eat the carbon pesach during its time period. Now, again, it's complicated because Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says Eina Pesach Nechal Ela Ad Chatzos, but nevertheless, it doesn't become nosar until the morning, which is complicated. Reb Chaim used to say that it has a shame zevach pesach throughout the night, even though you have to eat it to fulfill the mitzvah before chatzos. But in any event, it doesn't become nosar until the morning. So it's very shaykh that even according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, you have to eat the carbon pesach after chatzos in order that it should not become nosar. But you would not be makayim the mitzvah of achilas bos kizayis mi bosar pesach. Anyway. So here in the case where he violated the Iser Nosar, he doesn't get Malchus. Why doesn't he get Malchus? The Mishnah says that he's parted from Malchus. So you could give a whole bunch of different reasons here. First of all, you could say that Nosar is a Lav Shem Bo Maisa. Secondly, you could say Nosar is a Lav Anitak Liase because it's a mitzvah based Tisrofa. Thirdly, you could say he doesn't get Malchus because it's Asor Safek. What are you going to tell him? You better eat the basar, but he might decide later on to eat the basar. Shover Bitame ain't a lo carbon, right? Because the Isser Lav of Etzem Lo Sishbru that incurs Makkos, that's only in a carbon Pesach Tar. And if carbon Pesach is Tame, then it's not Roy Lachila. And the Torah says Etzem Lo Sishbru Bo as part of the mitzvah of Achila. But here it's not Roy Lachila because it's Tame. Hanotel Eim Al Abonim. This we had a long discussion about this, that he violates the Isser of Losuchal, that you're not allowed to take the Eim Al Abonim, but rather you have to send out the mother bird. Is Rabbi Yehuda Omer Loke V'Yeda Mishalit. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't see it as a lavanitak essay to exempt him from Malchus because the essay comes independent of the law. The Torah says Shalach to Shalach Esa'im. Chachamim Shalach Ve'en Aloka. The Rabbanan say that there are two dimensions to the mitzvah of Shalach to Shalach Esa'im. One is before he took the mother, and one is even after he took the mother. And after he took the mother, then it becomes a lavanitak essay, and he corrects the violation of the essay and the lav by sending out the mother bird. And now the Chachamim add a klal. Zeh klal kol mitzvos lo says yesh bo kum vasei is ein chayav and oleh. In other words, if the Torah tells you fix up the lav that you violated by doing an essay, you don't get malchus. So you, in a sense, rectify the violation by fulfilling the essay. Again, just to repeat, as we discussed at great length, there's machlokas exactly how that works. There's kimo v'lo kimo, bitlo v'lo bitlo. Machlokas Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Okay, fine. So now we start the sugya. Amar Rabba bar Chana Rabbi Yochanan. So we have a tradition in the name of Rabbi Yochanan regarding the parsha that has to be read when he brings the bikurim to the mizbeach in the Beis Hamikdash, and that's called the Rami Ovi Ovi. And our Mishnah says that even before he read the parsha, and all he did was kriya Hashem on the bikurim, no one's allowed to eat it. The Kohen is not allowed to eat it, and he gets malchus. Divrei Rabbi Akiva stima. Now the word stima sasa means that when Rebbe authored the Mishnayos, he based himself on Rabbi Akiva. So even though it's stimasa, Rabbi Akiva's name is not mentioned, we assume the ruling is a reflection of Rabbi Akiva's opinion. However, Aval Chachamim Omer Bikurim Hanocham HaKeves Bahem. It's not enough that you were Korei Shem. It's not even enough that you read the parsha of Arami Ovidovi. It's still not Bikurim. And therefore, if you ate from this fruit or vegetable or grain, you would not violate the Isur of Achilles Bikurim because you have to wait until the third stage, which is called Hanocha Al Gabi Mizbeach. And that's called Makeves Bahem. In other words, it's not Bikurim because you're missing a critical element of Hanoch Al Gabi Mizbeach. Kriya ain't Makeves Bahem. In other words, Kriya is not critical, but Hanocha is critical. Frek the Gemara of Alema Zu Divrei Rab Shimon Stimasa. Rabbi Yochanan said that this Mishnah should be attributed to the minority view of Rabbi Akiva. Why didn't he say it's the minority view of Rabbi Shimon? Because later on we're going to see the Gemara is going to quote a brisa that says explicitly that Rabbi Shimon is the one who holds that we don't have to wait for Hanocha. When it says Hakamashmalon, Rabbi Yochanan wanted to tell me on the side that Rabbi Akiva Rabbi Shimon Svirulay, that even though we know from a brisa this is the opinion of Rabbi Rabbi Yochanan wanted to add another point and another chiddush that Rabbi Akiva accepted the shita of Rabbi Shimon. My Rabbi Shimon. Now, where is Rabbi Shimon? In the Tanya, in the Bryce. The Torah says, "Lo sucha lechol b'sharech." Okay, now we're about to start a very long sugya. And you should remember the name Rabbi Shimon here because Rava at the end of this long sugya is going to praise Rabbi Shimon for darshaning a pasuk in Dvarim Perek Yud Beis. I believe it's in Parshas Rei, maybe not. Anyway, the pasuk is very complicated, and the pasuk talks about eating various types of kodshim. Again, it's not always kodshim, but in most 90% is kodshim outside of a certain location, and you get malchus for that. So, for example, the first thing on the list, as the Torah enumerates it, is Lo sucha lecha b'sharecha maser degoncha. Maser degoncha is a reference to maser sheni. Maser rishon is chulin, but maser sheni has to be eaten in Yerushalayim if you aren't part of it. And the Torah is telling me that if you eat the maser sheni outside of Yerushalayim, then you get malchus. You violate a law, Lo sucha lecha b'sharecha. And on this list, the only case that's not kodshim is maser sheni. Maser sheni is not kodshim. Why isn't it kodshim? Because the prerequisite for kodshim is that you require hakrav al gabi mizbeach. That's called haktorah seimurim. And you require a kohen and avoda. If it's not, like for example, maser sheni, I don't need a kohen to bring it to the city, the holy city of Yerushalayim. I don't need a mizbeach to allow me to eat or do the avoda of maser sheni. So that's not kodshim. But then the Torah says, "V'siroshcha v'yitzarecha," which are various descriptions of maser sheni, and then b'choros b'korch v'tzonecha. That's already b'chor. Now, in the world of kodshim, when you go from the lowest level up to the highest level, let's say, is a carbon olo, which is kulo kolil. The lowest level is going to be bechar. But, here's the but. Bechar has a very unique chumrah that puts it in a category of its own vis-a-vis all of kodshim. Namely, it's kadosh mirechav imo. From the moment that it's born, it's kadosh. That's not true for any other kodshim. Then the Torah on the list has kol nidorecha. And we're going to assume that nidorecha is a carbon ola because a classical neder is a carbon ola. Now, it could be that you could have an adava in shlum, but that's rare. And a person takes an adava, it's usually a carbon ola. Certainly in the case of a non-Jew, that's for sure. Anyway, and then it says after kol nidarecha asher tidar unidvosecha utrumas yadecha. Okay. So Rav Shimon is going to now take apart this pasuk, analyze it piece by piece, and darshan. Rav Shimon, ma bozel lamdein. He starts from the bottom up. It says trumas yadcha at the end of this pasuk. What is trumas yadcha? Elu bikurim. Now, why does yadcha indicate bikurim? Because the Torah says v'lakach hakohen hatenem yodecha in Dvarim Chafav in the Parsha of Aram Yov. So the word yodecha is referring to bikurim. Rav Shimon, ma bozel lamdein. What is the Torah teaching me about someone who eats bikurim outside of the Azara? Let's say he eats it outside of Yerushalayim. For that, I don't need a pasuk to tell me Yechayev Malkus. For eating bikurim outside Yerushalayim is kavachomi b'maser kal. Maser, as we said before, is not kudshim. And yet the Torah says if you eat it outside Yerushalayim, you get Malkus. You violate the law. How much more so bikurim? So why did the Torah have to tell me bikurim? Ma maser akal ochel chutz v'chabaloka bikurim lokolshke. Alopa kosuv elol yochel bikurim ad shalakara leha shehu loka. That this is Rabbi Shimon who reflects the opinion of our Mishnah, that with regard to the Isur Lav of Achilas Bikurim, even if he hasn't done Hanocha, nevertheless, he's Chayav Malkus. Not only hasn't he done Hanocha, but he hasn't been Koras Hashem. The implication would be that, according to Reb Shimon, if he was Korei Areli Es Hashem, then he would not be Chayav Malkus. We don't have to wait, like the Chachamim say, until Hanocha. So the Torah now, in the case of Bikurim, is telling me a special chidush that he gets Malkus because he hasn't yet been Korei Es Hashem. Then we go on in the pasuk, and mind you, we're going from the bottom backwards up, from Trumas Yodecha to the previous word in the pasuk Nidvosecha. Nidvosecha is Otodo Shlomim. Rav Shimon Abazel Lamdenu Imli Ochel Chutz Lechoma. If you ate the basar of the korban toda the shlomim outside of Yerushalayim, I don't need a pasuk for that to mechayv mi malchus. Kal v'chomer mi maser. As we said over and over again, maser is not kodshim. Toda and shlomim are kodshim. So certainly, if you're chayav for a lav of eating maser sheni out of Yerushalayim, how much more so in the case of kodshim of toda and shlomim? And this is in violation of the rule of Eina Onshim Min Adin. So it seems like Rav Shimon holds Onshim Min Adin, that you could use a Kal V'chomer to generate an Onesh, in this case of Malk. Kosav El Yochel B'Kodov Shlom L'fnei Zrika Shuloke. So in Todin Shlomim, if he ate from the basar, let's say he's a Kohen, or even the Bailim could eat from Todu Shlomim, because it's Kachim Kal. So they went ahead and they ate the basar of Toda or Shlomim before the Zrikas Adam. The Zrikas Adam is Mate the Achila. And by the way, the Zrikas Adam, as you know, is at the end of the process of the four avodas. You know, you start with Shchita, and then you have Kabbalah, and then finally you have Holacha, then Zrika. So the Zrika is the clincher, and it's Mate the Achila. In the case of Kachim Kalim, like Shlomim and Toda, even for Bailim. But he went ahead and he ate it before Zrika, he gets a Malchus. Then we go up the alleyway, and we get to Bechoros. Just 1 second, is that next? Or did I skip something? Yeah, Bechoros. Zeh Bechor. Amar Reb Shimon Abazel Lamdenu. Im liochel chutz l'chomer kal v'chomer mi maser. V'im lifnei zrika kal v'chomer mi todu shlomim. Now, why is Bechor more chomer than todu shlomim? That has to do with what I mentioned before, that is kadosh mirechem imo. So why did I need the Torah to tell me that you get malchus for the eating of a Bechor? El yochem in a Bechor afili achar zrika shuloke. Now, who are we talking about? If we're talking about a Kohen could eat a Bechor after Zrika. We must be talking here about a Zar, a non-Kohen. and he gets Malkus even after Zrikas Adam, meaning the Zrikas Adam is only Matir the Achilas Basar B'char for the Kohanim, but not for the Zorim, the non-Kohanim. Then we go up the alleyway again, and it says here in the pasuk, "Bekarcha v'tzonecha." What's that about? Zu chatas v'yasham. So we're up to kodshe, which can only be eaten by Kohen. Now again, if he ate it outside the choma, Maser is not even kodshe. V'im lifnei zrika is kal v'chomer v'toda ushlamim. If even a Kohen would eat basar, toda, ushlamim, which is kachim kalim, before zrika, then he gets malchus. How much more so in the case of kachim of chatas v'yosha? Im liyachar zrika, kal v'chomer v'char. B'char is not kachim. Now, at this point, Reb Shimon is totally oblivious to the fact that a Bechar has a Chumrah that doesn't exist even in Chatos V'Yoshem, namely, it's Kaddish Mirachamima. So where do you eat Kachim? You have to eat it in the Azar, which is called Lifnim Min HaKloim. He went ahead, and even after Zrika, which is Mati the Basar, inside the Azara, he went ahead and he ate it outside the Azara. And since it's Kachim, the Torah is teaching me he gets Malchus for eating a Kazayas Basar of Kachim, of Chatas vi Asham, outside of the Kloim, outside of the Azara. Now we get up to Nidorecha. Now, as we said before, Stam Neder is a Korban Ola, which is Kulo Kolil, is the most chomer on the top of the totem pole of Kodshim. What do I need a pasuk for? That's ridiculous. Kavachomer Maser. V'im polifnei zrika is Kavachomer mi Kodshim Kalim, which is Todin Shlamim. V'im liachar zrika, and he ate a chutz l'kloim. Well, then we have Chatas V'Yoshem. We have a Kol V'Chomer from Chatas V'Yoshem. Because Ola is not given to any Achila whatsoever. It's more Chomer than Chatas V'Yoshem. Holoba Kosuv. And here we turn to Daf Yitzayin Amid Beis.